Welcome to The Real Deal with Jason Silverman, the podcast dedicated to helping you build the business of your dreams and live the life you always hoped for, with valuable and fun tips and info to make your life easier and more fun. And now, here's your host, a man who sprinkles metal shavings on his breakfast cereal just for fun, Jason Silverman.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Real Deal with Jason Silverman. I'm your host today, Jason Silverman, and I'm thrilled to share some time with you. As you know, I'm always on the hunt for interesting as well as super smart real deal guests, and I got to tell you, I've been looking forward to today's show for a good couple of weeks. I want to introduce my listeners to somebody who's truly been there and done that, and I'm excited to pick his brain for your benefit today, and quite honestly, for my benefit as well. Now, for the folks who I work with in any of my coaching programs or through Powerful Words Character Development, All-Star Cheer Sites, or the Jason's Army Mastermind Group, you know how much I focus on the importance of simplicity in running our businesses, right? Well, this show is going to help us to do just that. So today it's going to be my honor and privilege to share an amazing resource with you. You're going to love today's guest. He's got a ton of valuable information about one of those concepts I consider really to be missing in most of the educational systems today. So strap yourself in. Today's show is going to be a blast. As I'm sure you already know, I'm committed to helping business owners just like you to become more successful, enjoy your career more, and in general, make your life significantly more fun. We only get one ride on this merry-go-round, folks. Let's make sure it's one hell of a ride, shall we? Alrighty, boys and girls, it is now that time. I want you to stop surfing Facebook, put away your phone, your tablet, your dog, your cat, your spouse, your child, anything that might possibly distract you from today's show. You're about to get some great and immediately implementable information, and I don't want you to miss even a second of it. So, before we officially get going, let me give you a little bit of background about our special guest expert today. Ken Segall worked closely with Steve Jobs as his ad agency creative director for over 12 years, spanning Next and Apple. He led the creative team behind Apple's iconic Think Different campaign and set Apple down the iWay by naming the iMac. Ken is the New York Times best-selling author of Insanely Simple and Think Simple, which explore the power of simplicity as practiced by Steve Jobs and other brilliant leaders. He currently consults with major brands in strategy, creative, and product naming. He blogs about technology and marketing at kensegall.com. That's KENSEGALL.com. And he has fun with it all at Scoopertino.com, which is SCOOPERTINO.com. Ken, welcome to The Real Deal. I'm thrilled to have you today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Pleasure is mine. So, listen, before we get started, for those who haven't had the opportunity and pleasure of meeting you or hearing you speak or reading either of these books yet, take a second, if you would, and share your story with our listeners. You know, what are you passionate about? What makes you tick? Who is Ken Segall?
That's a rather deep and probing question to begin with here, but I'll do my best. Actually, I'm an advertising guy. I've been that for many decades now, unfortunately. Sorry to admit. But I've always told people that I'm really like an advertising guy who doesn't like advertising. I mean, I get kind of annoyed by it, as many do. So I'm what I like to think of as sort of a culturally sensitive advertising guy, and I'm concerned about our environment, and I don't like to clutter our environment with a bunch of noise like many advertisers do. So I was raised by people who had these sort of moral standards in advertising and wanted to be like very, very creative at the same time. So Steve Jobs has given advice, which many have, about following your passion. My passion was always technology. Even when I was in high school, I was the guy who had the cool equipment in his house, and I would edit tapes and do all these things that were kind of creative with the limited technology we had back then. But I was able to sort of find a career where I could write about things that interested me, and technology interested me. So I think I would have been a terrible failure if I was forced to write ads for insurance companies and breakfast cereal and stuff like that. I had this interest in technology, so that's what I did. I went down that road, and people told me, you're going to get typecast. Maybe it's a bad idea, and I did it anyway because that's what I like to talk about. So that interest in technology and being in advertising as a writer led me from one technology account to another until I got hooked up with Steve Jobs. And I wouldn't have had that opportunity if I hadn't taken certain jobs before that. So it all led very logically. So I got involved with Steve Jobs when he was running Next, which was, as many know, the company he started when he was forced out of Apple. So I was helping him with that. And then when he moved back to Apple, I went along for the ride and switched over to that ad agency so I could keep working with him. So that turned out to be the experience of my advertising life. We did all kinds of exciting things, a lot of high pressure, but we did a lot of great work. I was part of a really good team, and Steve was really the best client an advertising guy could ever want because he demanded creativity, excellence, quality, all those things that you wish your clients would demand of you, but unfortunately not all that many do. So I think that's about it. We can fill in some details as we go along, but that's what got me into working with Steve and doing all the things that we did together.
I'm excited to dig in. That's I can only imagine the experiential knowledge that you gained from all of that. So you've now at this point written 2 books about simplicity. Why do you call it the most powerful force in business?
I think that Steve Jobs was a very, very vivid example of what can happen when you have a reverence for the power of simplicity. It struck me, the more I worked with him, the more I realized that this was the case with Steve, and I saw the results that it achieved. And I think a lot of people look at Apple products and think like, well, yes, they are simple and easy to understand, easy to work, and that's certainly the big reason why Apple became such a success. But I think what people failed to realize was just how widespread and deep the love of simplicity is within Apple, and how that affected Apple on so many different levels. So that's what I talk about. It's not just about the product that pops out of a company at the end. It's this deep-seated belief that runs throughout the company that sort of unifies the company in its efforts, and it makes the internal processes simpler, and the way they communicate with the public simpler, and the way they design their packaging simpler. All those things add up to some very, very big thing that literally propelled Apple from near death back in the late 90s. They were, seemingly going out of business, to become the world's most profitable company in just 14 years' time, to become the most valuable company on earth. In 14 years, that's just like miraculous. It's certainly never happened before, and it never happen again. I can't imagine it, at least not in our lifetimes. So I think the power of simplicity is something not to be trifled with. It is to be appreciated and leveraged, and you don't have to be Apple to succeed with the power of simplicity. And that's what after I did my book about Apple and Steve Jobs, I went around the world talking to business leaders in many different kinds of companies about how they have leveraged the power of simplicity. And again, it's not just in products. It's oftentimes in the way a company is organized, and the way it communicates, and the way it designs things, its website, and so on. There are just a lot of different aspects to simplicity, but I think when one really believes in it and nurtures it within his or her own company, it really is the most powerful force in business.
I love it. I know that one of the things I've been speaking about, at least in the cheer industry for the last couple of years, is the importance of simplicity in pricing. And I've always said that confused people don't buy. And so many folks have made things so convoluted and challenging to understand that when folks started making it easier, it did a number of things. Number one, all of a sudden their staff wasn't afraid to sell. Number two, the client wasn't afraid to buy. So even just that one end, and obviously there's so many other levels you could take simplicity to, but this truly did make a big change. So I get it.
I have a bunch of examples of things like that in the second book. when I talked to all these different leaders around the world. One story stuck out in my head, and it's directly related to what you just said. So if you'll indulge me,
please.
It's a short one. But the gentleman's name is Brian Hartzer. He is the CEO of Westpac Bank in Australia, which is the second biggest bank in the country. So they've got offices all over the country, tens of thousands of people working. And when he arrived in his position there, he looked at the credit card offerings. And there were like, I'm making up a number here, but it was in the high 20s. Call it like 28 different kinds of credit cards. And he thought that was really silly, because there are only so many kinds of customers in the world, and there are only so many kinds of credit cards, frequent flyer points and cash back and stuff like that. So he just made a simple grid, the types of customers on the top, old, young, business, whatever, and on the side, the different kinds of cards. And he said to his people, you can put one credit card in each of those boxes. And that ended up basically cutting their product offerings by about half, and sales went up. And he said it's because not only did the customers suddenly understand what they had to choose from, but his own people could explain to people when they asked, what's the difference between these four cards? Suddenly, every single card had, a target audience and a specific benefit, and people could just choose the one they want. And because they didn't have to say, well, let me go home and think about it, they were literally saying on the spot, that's the card for me, and they were buying it. So I think that's a great example of the power of simplicity. You don't have to give people, all these choices that just confuse them. You want to give them good choices. Certainly people want choice, but there's so many companies that just flood the market with products hoping that people will be able to figure it out. And obviously Apple is an example of a company that does not do that. They make very few products compared to most companies, but they try to make really, really good ones and give people distinct choices.
That makes sense. That totally makes sense. Now, you spent 12 years creating ads for Steve Jobs. How would you say your experience syncs up with the popular image of Steve? Is it accurate? Is it jaded?
Well, yeah, actually the popular image is not all that accurate. Like, as you would expect, when someone does a few spectacular things, that tends to become the story. And for Steve Jobs, his spectacular things were the products, but also his temper and his way of treating people, which, was quite known to be somewhat brutal. So I always tell people that, that was certainly part of his personality. I would never deny that. And I was on the receiving end of it a couple of times. It wasn't pleasant. And I certainly saw it happen to other people thankfully more of them than me. So I didn't get too badly bruised. But I did see him, on a weekly basis, and he was charismatic, he was visionary, he had a great sense of humor. We would just talk about stuff before and after meetings, just like regular people do, and he was just a fascinating guy. He was very, very smart, of course, as you would expect. But he had interesting opinions about people and, issues that are in the news and stuff like that. So it was just a really interesting experience, and not the one-sided, brutal guy who's terrible to be around, So I think the movies and books that have generally been written and created about Steve tend to focus on that popular image, because that seems to be a better character in a movie, a guy who treats people badly and just so intense it's almost difficult to talk to him. But Steve wanted to surround himself with creative people, and he wanted them to do their thing. He wasn't a micromanager. He didn't tell people what to do, but he urged them to do great things, and he'd make people do things over and over again because he didn't think they were great enough and stuff like that. That was certainly my experience in advertising. So I think he was a complex person, as pretty much every human being is. And he doesn't get enough credit for the charismatic part and his interest in really helping people live and work better. And like I said, his sense of humor, he was really fun to work with for me. I enjoyed my conversations with him when he wasn't, in one of his bad moods. So I guess as I like to explain it to people, it was somewhat like if you have a really stern father, you love your father and you want him to be happy. And when your father is happy, all is well. You had a good life. But in the back of your mind, there was always that thought, like, I don't want to make Dad mad at me because I know that's really painful. So, working with him was sort of a combination of those things. Excited to be there and wanting to impress him with your creativity because you wanted him to think you were really brilliant. But at the same time, you knew that if you didn't have all your thinking wrapped up very neatly and could defend your position, there was that fear that if, he might, get irritated, get disappointed in you, that kind of a thing. And there were plenty of times when he didn't like what we presented to him. And we would have passionate debates, just as he would have it with his engineers and designers. I mean, he enjoyed that. He wanted people to be honest and to have a passion for what they believed. And he, those conversations could get loud. When you're experiencing it didn't seem terribly stressful to me, to be honest. It was just interesting. And there were times when, like, oh boy, now we've already had to go back to the drawing board once or twice here, and we really have to hit a home run in this next meeting. So there was that kind of feeling. But, it was only after I stopped working with him, to be honest, that I realized how much pressure I was under because there was this great feeling of lightness. After all those years, I thought, oh, I guess I was under pressure. I never really felt it before. It was just sort of this ongoing thing where you just had to do one great thing after the next to rise to Steve Jobs' standards. And I think at the end of the day, that's the kind of boss or client that everybody would want to have, somebody who will never settle for something less than what you could achieve. And there were plenty of times also when, well, not plenty, but I remember a couple where he would reject some idea that you really loved, and you'd have that big argument about it, and then finally have to do something else, and what you end up with is actually better than that first idea, and you'd have to go home and think, wow, he was really right all along. I like this new thing much better than that first thing. So, you had to give him credit for having an eye and ear, and he was the man who created Apple, and he had that vision of what he wanted the company to be, and your work had to rise to the standard of that vision. It's a challenging thing, but a very, very rewarding thing.
Oh, I bet. I want to switch gears for a sec. The Think Different campaign that marked the beginning of Apple's resurrection back in '97. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, that was an interesting time because Steve Jobs would explain in later years that at that moment in history, Apple was 90 days away from bankruptcy. I mean, things were that bad. The death watch was on for Apple, because they had gone through like 11 years of mediocrity and plummeting sales. They were losing money for some number of quarters in a row. I think it was quite a few. It was maybe like a couple of years they'd been losing money. So they were bleak times, and Steve came back as basically the only man who could save Apple because he was Apple. He was the guy who started the company, and he had the credibility with the employees to inspire them. And, so that was the situation. And then he, as far as ad agencies go, Steve got the band together again, basically. He got rid of the agency that John Scully had brought in. He went back to the agency he used to have. I went over to that agency, and, things started happening again. Steve was happy about the team he had put together upon his return. But the problem was that Apple was, had this terrible performance issue where they were losing money and had no great products. So the first thing he did was get the engineers going, Johnny Ive and his team, to create the iMac. But that wasn't going to happen for many, many months because they were just starting work on it. The issue was, what will we do now? We have at least a half a year, and the attention of the world was on Apple because Steve had just returned, and that was a big deal. But we had nothing to talk about, really. We had no new computers to show. So Steve thought, well, I guess we worked it out together. I'm not sure exactly who had the original kernel of the idea, but it would be a good thing. We all agreed to have a brand campaign that would tell the world that the spirit of creativity is alive and well at Apple, and we're going to sort of create this foundation for all the work that's going to come in the coming years. And that's what Think Different was all about. And the idea of it was, I mean, for people who don't even remember it, we would basically just show full page, if it was in a magazine, a full page portrait of some person who had changed the world in a very positive way. And we had a wide variety of people in the arts and science and design and all kinds of things, music. And on that page, it would say nothing more than Think Different and have an Apple logo. And that was, to celebrate the lives of people who changed the world in really fantastic ways. And the principle was that if you tell somebody who it is that you admire, that says a lot about you as a human being. So we thought that if we tell the world who Apple admires, that would just say a lot about what kind of company we are. So we celebrated for a good 6 months there just the lives of all these people, and they were, like, again, such a wide variety of people. We had John Lennon and Alfred Hitchcock and Albert Einstein and Thomas Edison. I mean, people who really contributed to the world in wildly different ways. But that was like our way of saying this is who Apple is. And we make tools for people who want to put their mark on the world and help move things forward in a creative way. And that struck a chord with an awful lot of people, that Apple stood for creativity and innovation and humanity, basically. And, a lot of technology companies are kind of stuck in technical specs and things like that, and Apple was very, very human. So the idea was to tell Apple's customers that Apple was alive and well, but it was also to tell Apple's employees that this is what we're all about, and to fire them up. The day that campaign broke, Steve put out a company-wide email telling everybody about the campaign and telling them that thinking different is what made Apple a success in the early days, and it will continue to do that in the future. And he wanted everybody in the company to look at their jobs, no matter what they do, whether they're the receptionist or a software designer. Look at your job and think about how you could think different about it. Is there a better way to do what we do? And we want to hear from everyone. And everyone got Think Different T-shirts, and it really just fired up the company, in such a great way. And then for the public, Apple, very believably stood for a company that thinks different, so that when the new products came, and when the iMac came, I think it was about 8 months later, it looked like nothing you had seen before in the world of computers. It was translucent blue instead of beige and boring. And it made everything so much simpler as far as like getting on the internet, which was a tough thing in those days. So it looked so different visually that all we really had to do was put a picture of the computer on a page and say Think Different under it, and it made perfect sense. And it just totally captured what the company was all about. And all the products after that did the same thing. They just looked different, and they did really cool things. So for the first 4 years, basically, everything Apple did was about thinking different. And every single bit of communication that we created had to logically end in the words Think Different. So every headline, every ad, that was our standard. That we have to reinforce this one simple thought, that's what Apple is all about. Every product we come out with will be the proof that Apple thinks different. So it was an incredible simplifier for all of our marketing, because that was the beacon, the guiding light, those two simple words. And Steve, by the way, just really loved, the whole idea of that campaign. We did a launch commercial that you may be familiar with called The Crazy Ones. You can see it on YouTube. Steve just thought this was just the ultimate, the essence of Apple had been captured in this commercial, and he just loved that spot. Ran it for many, many years later at his product introductions. Like, he would start the show by showing that commercial because it so perfectly captured the spirit of Apple.
I love it. And one of the things that just keeps bouncing around in my mind is how brilliant it is and was to, start with, the core of the firm and the belief system of the firm, and then roll that out so that the marketing was completely congruent with, the principles and belief systems, so that when people actually wonder, who is or what is Apple, like, there was no question. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because one of the things I talk about when I travel from place to place is this idea of authenticity. And it's not anything new in the advertising world. Authenticity was always valued. But Apple is a very good example, the Think Different campaign in particular, of a company that didn't try to create some new kind of personality for itself and say it's all new thinking, all new people, and all that kind of stuff. Apple just said, rather than do that, let us just do a really good job of explaining to people exactly who we really truly are, And the beauty of Think Different, I thought, was that even though we were doing it in 1997, you could have put those words up in the garage when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak created their very first computer back in the late 70s. It would have made perfect sense. That's what the company was always about. And you could still use those words today if you cared to. Apple, they really, really do capture this authentic thing about Apple, is that, they go places other people don't go and try to achieve much better results by doing so. So it's authenticity at work, basically. It's much easier to tell people who you really are than try to invent some new kind of personality for yourself and then try to get them to change their opinion of you.
Exactly. I love that. Now, you've got a really interesting point of view about the power of choice, or I guess I should say the power of less choices. Would you mind talk about that a little bit? Because I feel like this is a concept missing in the after-school activity world. We've made things so hard, so convoluted. What's the benefit of less choice?
Well, that example I gave earlier about Westpac Bank in Australia is a great one. But the principle that makes it work, I think, is that each and every one of us has burnt into our DNA a desire for a simpler way. And choice becomes a part of that. So I think if you offer people two different routes to a similar conclusion, say you're in the business of selling laptop computers, and you say, here are three, there's good, better, best, and here's what makes each of these things different. So which kind of person are you? Then click the buy button and you're done. So the end result there is you get a computer that you want. But a lot of companies, Dell and HP in particular, I do regular research on their website to count up how many laptop computers they offer. It's like crazy. It's over 40 for HP and over 20 for Dell. But so the point is that if you're trying to buy a computer from one of those guys, you got a lot of studying to do, or you got to read, buying guides, and what really is the difference? It's almost like those credit cards. There are differences, but they're sort of subtle, and you got to really think a lot. And a lot of people, faced with that kind of choice, get sort of frozen into inaction. And I think, the experience of shopping with someone like Apple is that, like, you go away thinking, wow, that was easy, and you're happy with the product you bought. With the other guys, you might even end up with a bit of buyer's remorse when you see an ad for a different computer they make, and you go like, oh, that sounds even better than the one that I just bought, So I think it makes customers, a lot happier. It's like Apple doesn't offer them less choice; they offer them less confusion, basically.
That's a great way to put it. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that.
Yeah, and I think when someone satisfies that thing that's inside all of us, the desire for simplicity, you tend to relate to the company that gives you that tends to earn your love, we'll call it. In the case of Apple, it is love. People go overboard because Apple makes shiny products that people can hold in their hand and fall in love with. Other companies can't quite do that, so love for them might be a bit different. But when if you're an insurance company and you have a website that makes it totally simple to buy your insurance, people aren't going to have that same kind of love like they do with an Apple, but they will have that feeling like, wow, these guys really understood what I'm all about. They made it easy for me. And if I'm talking to someone then who's saying I kind of need to get some insurance, I might say something like, oh, well, I just did this thing with these guys a few months ago and they made it really easy. So you actually, you recommend the experience to other people when you've had a good experience. And I think that's been key to Apple's growth because its customers are so happy and so satisfied that Apple is fulfilling this desire for a simpler way that they do sell to their friends and their family and their colleagues. It just sort of builds on itself. And I think the choice thing is a big part of that. One of the things, I found this quote from Devo. I was not a big Devo fan, but it is in one of their songs, apparently, where they say, freedom of choice is what you got. Freedom from choice is what you want. And I think that might be a little too simplistic, but it's true. I think putting these choices on people, constantly, just saying, well, you pick, we make 30 things, pick one. Right. It's very different from a company that says, we really know you pretty well. We know people like you, and we have found that these 3 things, give you all the choice you need. And you can pick whether you want the high-end pro specs or the super lightweight thing. They have different reasons to be purchased, and it's not hard to identify which one it is that you want. And then you buy. I think there's less hesitation to hit the buy button.
Well, as somebody who is an Apple convert, I was always a PC guy. Who run some tech companies, and then I got sick and tired of buying a new laptop every year. I got sick and tired of horrific malware and viruses and all sorts of other weird, crazy stuff that just kept happening over and over and over again. And I remember my tech consultant at the time was like, "Why don't you just buy an Apple and make your life easier?" Well, I need all the choices and I need this. He's like, you really don't. So why don't you take a look? And I remember walking into the Apple store going, this is it? Really? And the guy was like, do you want this one or this one? I'm like, well, normally when I go to look at a computer, I've got 47 different choices and then I have to research and then I've got to do this and I've got to... He's like, yeah, that's not this. Do you want this one or that one? And I bought that one, and that must be now, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago.
Excellent.
And, I've never looked back, and it's funny, the experience of having less choice has truly made life dramatically easier. So I get it. And again, it's one of those things that I try to impart upon my clients of, just make it easy for people to give you money. This isn't challenging.
Yeah, exactly. My experience is actually somewhat similar to yours. I was always an Apple guy, but I had this thing about choice, and I had to have Microsoft Word, and I had to seek out the best software for everything I was doing, and I'd use a different thing for my music than Apple had. And maybe it's part of, getting older and, the things you want to concentrate on doing with your time. And I ended up like, okay, Word is too complicated, and, I use Apple's word processor, Pages, and Keynote for presentations and stuff. And, it is, technically those things do less. You can, there isn't all that deep complexity, if you have some super serious need. But I realized that what I did was actually pretty darn simple, and I didn't need to be doing those things. And so I kind of made a similar decision where I just said, you know what, I just want to make life easy for myself. And I did that. And I sort of, I guess, for design purposes, I use, Adobe products. But most of everything, I'm in the Apple world, and everything syncs, and I don't have to worry about it. Phone, iPad, computer. And I know you can do those things with other products too, but, you keep rewarding the people who have made your life easier and continue to make your life easier. So it's all about loyalty, and that is something that Apple has been very good at also. By giving people those things product after product, they build that resistance to go somewhere else. So, the conversation about who really makes the best product, it's not unimportant. But there's so many other factors involved. And like with music, for example. I was an audiophile. I was a musician before I got into advertising. Well, I was a drummer. Some people would argue that's not really a musician, but my bandmates used to rib me on that one. But then I realized that, I know when I put the music on my iPod, it's not quite the same. The quality is less. But honestly, to my ear, it wasn't. I couldn't really even notice it. And just having the ability to have all my music with me and listen, find music more easily, all that stuff that gave to me, I realized technically that I'm getting a lesser quality of music, but the convenience is so much more that it was just worth it to me. And I kind of, I had a fancy camera before, and, the pictures you can take with your smartphone these days are very, very good, but they're not the quality of a real camera. But it's so much easier because your phone is always in your pocket, and that camera is a pain in the butt to drag around everywhere. So I think certain trade-offs are absolutely worth it, because I think a simpler life is a very, very important thing. And it's a very appealing thing to people because, again, we all have that gene within us that says, do it the easy way, and then you'll have more time to do the other things in your life that are more challenging.
Totally makes sense. I agree. Here's a question I've been dying to ask you because nobody else has really ever given me the answer to this. I know you're responsible for putting that little I in front of all of Apple's product names. So what does it mean?
Good story. People pay good money to hear the story. Just kidding. I've told it 1,000 times now, probably. So but it's fun because it's one of those things. Steve Jobs always pushed for better and better, and he resisted the I. He thought it was, not worthy. Basically, for 2 presentations. But the backstory is that when that computer came out, I mentioned earlier that the internet was not nearly as easy as it is today, back in 1998. So the idea of the concept of the iMac, every computer that's made kind of needs to have an overarching concept. And for iMac, it was an easy way to get on the internet. You didn't have to buy a separate modem. You didn't have to configure anything. You'd plug in the power and you'd plug the phone line in, which sounds archaic, but that's the way it was back then. But the modem was built into the computer. And basically, you'd turn on that computer the very first time, and it would come up and say, want to get on the internet? So say, sure. Give it your credit card, create a screen name for your email, that is, your email address, and you're in business. And people found that very, very refreshing. So that was, the first bit of simplicity that Apple offered upon Steve's return. But we needed a name for it. And Steve had a name that one of his guys had given him, and he was all hot on the name, which shockingly was MacMan. That was the name that he was settled on, but he said he wanted us to try to do better. And that was a common thing with Steve, that he would say, this is a direction we're going, so if you can do better, now's the time to speak up, or it's going to forever be MacMan, basically, in this case. So we thought that was a terrible name, and people who are in the room, when I meet them today, that's one of the first things, it inevitably comes up in the conversation. Oh, my God, remember MacMan? But Steve had it in his head. He thought there was something kind of Sony-like about it because of Walkman. And he thought that was a good thing. Back in those days, Apple did not make any handheld products. He thought it was a way to give this desktop computer some personality. So that's what we were working with. And he said, come back in a week, show me some names. So iMac was actually the first name I came up with. I mean, it was not literally the first. It was probably in the first 5, because it was like, well, it's an easy way to get on the Internet. I for Internet, Mac for Macintosh. So it really wasn't any more complicated than that. It was actually, I thought, more logical than it was creative. Although, in later years, I've come to appreciate, all the things that allowed Apple to do. But anyway, Steve didn't like it, showed him 5 names, including iMac, hated them all, came back a week later, he still didn't like it, showed him new names then, and then brought back the old one because he still believed in that one. And then it was just a couple of days later that, talking to somebody inside Apple, they told me that Steve had the name put on a model and he was showing it around, and wow, I didn't know he liked it that much, but he was getting reactions, and apparently he got a lot of good reactions. So it became iMac. And it's funny because we said at the time, well, the way I presented it to him was that I obviously meant Internet, but it could also mean individual, I meaning me, imagination, inspiration. There were a lot of interesting I words. And indeed, when Steve unveiled the iMac at the big event, he did put a screen up and had all those I words on there. But very quickly, it just became a letter that basically identified a product as a consumer product from Apple. So you'd have Macs that were the computers, and you'd have iThings that were the consumer products. That didn't happen overnight, but in our original presentation, when we were arguing about all those things, we did point out that I could be a foundational name because we could have other I things. But again, like I say, at that time, all we had was computers, so that wasn't a big part of the argument. It was just like one of those little bits, that we might consider in the future. But then very quickly, after the success of iMac, we had, we knew that the iBook was going to come. We had that figured out already, that when the portable was ready, we would call it an iBook. And then all the software started to come. So we have a thing that does photography. Let's call it iPhoto. So it all fell into line very, very quickly. And suddenly, before you know it, Apple had 20 different iThings out there. And then, of course, the whole world started creating iThings, which is probably the reason why Apple's in the process of moving away from that now with Apple Watch, Apple Music, Apple Pay. Those were all consumer things that in the old days would have been iThings. But I think there's one too many lawsuits these days involving the I, so it's probably better for Apple to just say we have an Apple Watch and we have Apple Music, and who knows, in the very near future we may well have an Apple phone instead of an iPhone.
Wow.
We'll see.
That's actually very cool. So what advice would you give to folks who want to leverage the power of simplicity, but are really just looking for a place to start? Because I got to believe there are folks on this podcast going, yeah, this is all well and good for Apple, but I don't have their budget or experience or staff. How can I start?
Well, funny you should ask that question, because that's the question I posed to a lot of these people I interviewed in the new book, and I got a number of interesting opinions. Well, actually, one of the interesting things I found is that they all had a similar opinion, or many of them did. And that was, again, not shockingly new advice, but I know that it was important to Steve Jobs, and these other people felt that it was important to them as well. And that is just the ability to sort of step outside the company and see it as a consumer sees it. And although you would think everybody in the world would be good at that, every business person, it really is remarkable, having worked with as many companies as I have in my advertising life, it's interesting how many companies don't do that very well, that they have all their reasons that they have to compromise on this experience and that experience because it's going to cost too much money, or the boss said something a year ago and he wouldn't like this, so we're not going to do it. There are all these things that you run into that get very, very frustrating in this world when you're dealing with business people. And I think Steve was really, really good at being able to see things as a consumer does. And whenever there was a decision to make, which would be the best customer experience was always the clincher. If it were something that cost more money or took more time, if it was a better customer experience, he would say, well, obviously that's the thing we have to do. But then, of course, a moment later, he'd look at you and say, now it's your job to find a way to do it faster and cheaper. So there was no really winning with him on that one, but he would never compromise on the customer experience. And I think these other leaders I talked to had similar feelings about, when people go to our website or when they open the box or when they interact with customer service or when they see our ads, what are they thinking? And is it good enough? Is the experience so good that they would actually tell their friend that, hey, you should look at this company? Because, again, word of mouth is vastly more powerful than any ad could ever be. You want people out there, getting emotionally attached to your company, so to the point where they might actually mention it to their friends and family. So these people were pretty good at that. And they also had a disdain for too much process. So they sort of stood outside their companies and they said, why do we have, why does an idea have to go through 4 different levels of approvals to get from the beginning to the end? Why don't we have really brilliant people having great ideas and then having one brilliant person approve it, the final decision maker? So things like that. So these people had all kinds of interesting ways of looking at their own company, really with fresh eyes. And it sounds easier than it is, because when you're working inside a company or when you're leading a company, you're so aware of all the constraints and cost factors and time and the target audience and what they're thinking and this and that. A lot of these guys would sort of, they would consider all those things, but they would go with their gut very often. There's this thing about instinct, which obviously Steve Jobs had. But when you have a whole life of 20 or 30 years, or whatever it is, the experience you have in your field, and you get some bit of research that seems contrary to that, it takes a very special kind of person to say, I see what you're saying to me, but I believe in my heart that this is the right way to go. And so these people had this ability, I thought, to really look at their companies, through the emotional lens, through the way customers would look at them, and make decisions accordingly. They didn't tolerate the busy work and the complex processes that build up in a company over time. And if I can go back to that man from Westpac Bank in Australia, he said a lot of very interesting things. One of the things he said was that when you become mired in all this complexity, one really fantastic thing to do is to swim upstream and go back in time and look at the pure first version of that product or service or whatever it was. And you see what the original thinking was and why it was what it was. And then you can sort of judge all the things that have been layered on top of it over time and realize, there might have been a fix at one point, but then someone made a fix to the fix and fix to the fix to the fix. And it gets very, very complicated. If you go back to that pure version, you get a better appreciation for why that product or service existed in the first place, and what have you lost over time. So there are all kinds of things you can do, and like I say, I tried to put them all in this book. I'm not trying to sell books here, but they're stepping outside the company. They're seeing things through the eyes of the consumer. They're swimming upstream. There's keeping meetings small. The principle that's so important inside Apple is small groups of smart people. They don't have big, massive, efforts. They trust people who are really smart to come up with a good solution. They're more willing to work all the hours it would take to find the solution because they feel responsible. There are all these principles that make a company simpler. A lot of them are just common sense, but you need, to sort of recalibrate your brain to prioritize those things and not just think, well, they're so obvious they're going to take care of themselves, because they never do. Complexity grows through the cracks. If if you're not paying attention to the way your company works, it's going to get more complicated unless you really manage the way simplicity is protected and the way complexity is defended against.
I like that. So well said. All right, Ken, it's time for our resource of the week. So tell me this. How can my listeners find out more about you and how you're actually helping the world to become better by making it more simple?
Well, KenSegall.com is my place to start. I have a blog. I try to keep current. You can access that through my homepage. A watchful eye on technology and marketing, I call it. And then, of course, we haven't even touched upon the Cupertino thing, but there's so much focus on Apple that we make up stories. We're like the Onion of the Apple world. Apple-centric humor, if you can imagine such a thing. You might think there's a small market for it, but we've had like over 5 million viewers since we started the thing. And that's something we don't even make money on. It's pure fun. We don't even make enough money to pay for our server time, our server space. So one of the things, by the way, that Steve Jobs loved was when he saw Apple, like when they did a skit on Saturday Night Live that was about an Apple product or something. He thought that was hilarious, and he thought it meant that Apple was actually becoming a part of culture. And he thought that was a really, really cool thing. So when we started Cupertino, kind of just having fun with the bad things people say about Apple, they only want your money and they want to run the world and all that kind of stuff that we don't personally believe, but it makes for fun satire. So we make up these stories based on current events, and when Apple has a problem, we sort of make fun of it. But it's kind of, when you respect someone, you want to have fun with them, and we get our share of Apple haters there, which is interesting because I think they think we're serious, but it's all part of the fun. You read the comments and people go crazy with, half of them think it's true, even though we do our best to say, no, it's fake news, but these days it's harder to tell.
Yeah, tell me about it. That makes a lot of sense. All right. I always loved, and actually just for anybody who's not streaming this off of the show notes page, you can find Ken's blog at KenSegall.com, which is KenSegall.com. If you are in the show notes, you can simply click through. Ken, I always like to end my podcast with one telling question. So if you could give business owners just one solid piece of advice to either help their business or probably more importantly, help them to live a better life, what would that one piece of advice be?
Well, as I said before, there's so many things about simplicity. It sounds too easy. So when I offer my advice, it sounds too obvious. But the thing that I think is most important is focus. And I think people talk about it, but I think very few people deliver on it. And I think that means not making too many products, just doing a really, really good job on the ones that you do make, and not worrying about trying to satisfy giant segments of the population. Just focus on your message in marketing. Don't try to do 10 things at once. Steve Jobs was incredible at that. He totally changed the way Apple advertised, the way it invested in advertising. There was one message every quarter, and they used to have like 10 of them. So focus, very simple concept, but again, a tough one to pull off unless you really, really put the effort into it.
I think that's fair. I think that's very fair. Ken, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much. I have like 6 pages of notes here myself. Thank you for joining me today. I know how busy your schedule is, so it means the world to me to share some of your time and a whole bunch of wisdom with me and our listeners. So again, thank you.
Well, again, it was my pleasure. I enjoy talking about this stuff, and if it helps anybody, then even better.
I think it does. It absolutely does. All right, folks, that's all the time we've got for today. Thanks so much for tuning into The Real Deal with Jason Silverman. For more info about private coaching or to see if you'd benefit from one of my mastermind groups, visit me over at www.jasonmsilverman.com. I look forward to helping you achieve the success that you truly deserve. Until next time, let me leave you with this. Get out there and be the real deal. Set a goal, make a plan, work like hell towards it, and achieve the success that's waiting for you. Now's the time. Get out there and make it happen. Now, this has been Jason Silverman, and I hope you have a spectacular week.
You've been listening to The Real Deal with Jason Silverman. To access the great resources mentioned in the show and for information on coaching and mastermind group opportunities with Jason, please visit jasonmsilverman.com.